Azure Cost Optimization for Startups, cut spend by 40%.
So, Azure Cost Optimization for Startups.
It's something a lot of people ask about, and today we're going to walk through it step by step. Let's talk about next up, why Azure Cost Optimization for Startups requires a different playbook. Enterprise Azure Cost Management content dominates search results.
It assumes a FinOps team, a dedicated cloud architect, and 6-month optimization roadmaps.
Most early-stage startups have a 2-person engineering team and infrastructure built for speed rather than cost efficiency. The core challenge with Azure Cost Optimization for Startups is that the highest leverage tactics differ entirely from what works at enterprise scale.
For a company spending $5,000 per month, the wins come from 3 areas: eliminating waste, buying compute smarter, and building scaling logic into the architecture from the start. Enterprise content skips the first 2 and jumps straight to governance frameworks that require headcount you don't have.
One other difference worth noting: startup workloads are inconsistent. You might have 5 customers today and 500 in 6 months. That uncertainty makes committing to multi-year reserved capacity feel risky.
The good news is that Microsoft has made reserved instances flexible enough that the risk is manageable, and there are free tier and credit programs that reduce upfront exposure considerably.
Next up, now, how much can a startup actually save? The 40% number explained.
The 40% savings figure comes from stacking multiple tactics, not any single change. Here's how the math typically breaks down for a startup spending $5,000 to $15,000 per month on Azure.
No single tactic reaches 40% on its own.
But reserved instances combined with autoscaling typically cuts compute costs by 45 to 55%. Since compute usually represents 50 to 65% of total Azure spend, that combination alone produces a 22 to 35% total bill reduction before you touch storage, networking, or PaaS services.
The honest caveat: compute-heavy applications see the biggest gains.
Startups where egress costs or blob storage dominate need a different focus for those line items. Effective Azure Cost Optimization for Startups always starts with a breakdown by service category before deciding which tactic will have the most impact. Now, let's talk about Azure Reserved Instances, your biggest lever for startup cost reduction.
Reserved instances are where Azure Cost Optimization for Startups delivers the fastest, most measurable return.
Azure Reserved Instances let you pre-commit to a specific VM size in a given region for 1 or 3 years, in exchange for a discount of 30 to 72% compared to pay-as-you-go pricing. The 3-year option offers the steepest discount, but most early-stage companies choose 1-year reservations to preserve flexibility as their workload changes. A concrete example: a standard _D4S_V3 VM running 24/7 in East US costs about $280 per month at pay-as-you-go rates. A 1-year reservation drops that to roughly $168, saving $112 per month per instance. Running 8 similar VMs means $10,752 recovered per year from one 15-minute purchasing decision. A few things most startup teams miss about reserved instances.
Now, next up, Azure Autoscaling for Startups. Stop paying for idle compute. Reserved instances lower the unit cost of compute. Autoscaling lowers how much compute you actually run. Together, these 2 tactics form the backbone of Azure Cost Optimization for Startups running web applications or API-heavy workloads. Azure Autoscaling automatically adjusts the number of running instances based on real demand, so you're not paying for 12 servers at 3 a.m. when 2 could handle the load. This matters most for startups with traffic patterns that vary by time of day or day of week, which describes most B2B SaaS products. 3 main autoscaling options to consider. Next up, now, right-sizing Azure VMs for your startup workload. Over-provisioned VMs are the most common waste pattern in Azure Cost Optimization for Startups. The reasoning at provisioning time makes sense: you don't know peak load yet, so you pick something with headroom. A year later, those D8S_V3 instances are running at 12% average CPU utilization. Right-sizing means matching the VM SKU to actual workload requirements rather than theoretical peak demand. Azure Advisor does most of the analytical work for free. It reviews 30 days of CPU, memory, and network utilization data and flags instances where you can safely downsize.
A typical finding, a D8s_V3 running under 15% CPU can be downsized to a D4s_V3, cutting that instance's cost by roughly 50%. 6 such VMs saves approximately $5,000 per year with no performance impact.
Let's talk about spot instances and free Azure credits for startups. Two tactics that cash-constrained pre-seed teams consistently overlook: spot instances for non-critical workloads and Microsoft's startup credit programs. Both belong in any Azure cost optimization for startups toolkit.
Azure Spot instances offer up to 90% off VM pricing by using spare Microsoft data center capacity. The trade-off is that Microsoft can evict spot instances with a 30-second notice when that capacity is needed elsewhere.
For the right workloads, this is entirely acceptable. Good candidates for Azure Spot instances.
Now, next up, Azure budget alerts and cost controls every startup needs.
No plan for Azure cost optimization for startups is complete without cost visibility.
The most common cause of Azure bill surprises: nobody knew spend was climbing until the invoice arrived.
Budget alerts fix this in about 10 minutes.
Azure Cost Management lets you set monthly budget thresholds and trigger email alerts at configurable percentages of that budget. You can also configure forecasted alerts, which trigger when Azure projects you'll exceed your budget before the month ends, giving you time to act rather than just react.
Setup steps. Now, moving on to the Azure Cost Optimization Checklist for pre-seed and Series A startups. Generic best practices don't map to startup constraints.
The tactics that work at pre-seed differ from those at Series A, and conflating them is why most Azure cost guides feel irrelevant to founders working against real budget pressure. This checklist fills that gap.
Pre-seed. Series A. Let's talk about moving on to conclusion. Azure cost optimization for startups is not a one-time project.
It is a set of ongoing practices: reserved instances for predictable workloads, autoscaling for variable demand, right-sizing reviews every 90 days, and weekly budget checks instead of monthly invoice surprises. Startups that build these habits early typically maintain 30 to 40% lower cloud costs than peers at the same growth stage. The tactics in this guide are specific enough to start this week.
Budget alerts take 10 minutes to configure. An Azure Advisor right-sizing review takes 30 minutes.
Evaluating which VMs qualify for reserved instances takes about an hour. That is roughly 2 hours of work with a potential annual saving of $20,000 to $60,000 for a team currently spending $8,000 to $12,000 per month on Azure. If you want help building an Azure cost strategy tailored to your stage and workload profile, our team offers a free 30-minute infrastructure cost review. We have helped startups cut Azure spend by an average of 38% within the first 90 days.